The lantern flickered and died. In the absolute darkness of that one-room line shack somewhere deep in the Colorado Rockies, with snow hammering the walls like fists demanding entry, Pauline Wells said the words she had been swallowing for 3 days straight. "You have been lying to me since the moment you rode into Creed." Abraham Keating did not answer right away. She could hear him breathing across the dark space between them, that slow, measured breath of a man who had learned long ago to control every reaction, every impulse, every honest feeling that tried to claw its way out of him. The wind screamed around the corners of the shack. The cold was so complete it had weight to it, pressing against her skin like a hand. "Pauline," he finally said, and the way he said her name, not as a dismissal, not as a deflection, but as something careful and raw, made her chest tighten in a way she absolutely refused to allow. "Do not say my name like that," she said. "Like it means something to you. Like I mean something to you. You were sent here to bring me back to Denver. That is the truth, is it not?" The snow continued its assault. Outside, the world had vanished entirely. There was nothing beyond these 4 walls except white death, and inside those 4 walls there were only the 2 of them, and 3 days' worth of pretending that this was anything other than what it was. A trap, a mission, a lie dressed up in campfire conversation and stolen glances, and the warmth of a man who had touched her hand once, just once, when she had nearly fallen crossing the frozen creek, and had not let go for 4 full seconds longer than necessity required. "Yes," Abraham Keating said, and that single word detonated in the darkness between them like a charge of blasting powder. Pauline had suspected. She had known, somewhere in the intelligent and battered corner of her mind that had kept her alive through everything that had come before this moment. But hearing it confirmed was an entirely different thing. Her hands, which she had been pressing flat against her thighs to keep them still, curled into fists. "Who hired you?" she said. "It was not a question. You already know. I want to hear you say it." Another silence. Then, "Your husband." The word hit her like a slap across cold skin. But here is the thing about Pauline Wells. She did not flinch. She had stopped flinching 2 years ago. Somewhere between the night she fled Denver with nothing but a carpetbag and the name of a woman in Creed who owed her a favor, and the morning she had woken up in a rented room above a saloon and realized she was, for the first time in her adult life, completely and entirely free. She had built something in Creed, a small thing, a fragile thing, but entirely her own. And now it sat behind her, buried under 6 feet of October snow, and in front of her sat the man who had been sent to drag her back to the life she had escaped. She should hate him. She had very good reasons to hate him. So why, when he crossed the dark room toward her, and she heard his boots on the plank floor, and felt the heat of him stop just close enough to be felt but not close enough to touch, did she feel something entirely different from hatred? That was 3 days ago now. 3 days since she had learned the truth. 3 days of silence and tension, and the forced proximity of a space barely 12 feet across, with 1 bunk, 1 stove, and a week's worth of provisions. Because the snow had not stopped, had not slowed, had not shown any indication that it intended to release them before it was good and ready. 3 days since Pauline Wells and Abraham Keating had stopped being strangers, and not yet arrived at being honest. This is how they got here. Creed, Colorado was a silver town, which meant it was loud and dirty and full of men with more ambition than sense and women who had learned to navigate that particular combination with varying degrees of success. It had sprung up practically overnight in 1890, following a massive silver strike, and by the time Pauline arrived in the spring of that same year, it was already a town of several thousand souls crammed into a narrow canyon. The buildings stacked so close together they practically leaned against one another like tired men at a bar. Pauline had taken work at the Creed Millinery and Dress Shop, which was owned by a woman named Mrs. Hortense Buckley, who was 60 years old and sharp as a new blade, and who had not asked Pauline a single question about where she came from or why she had arrived with shadows under her eyes and a wariness about her that had nothing to do with the long road. Hortense had simply looked at her, assessed her, and said, "Can you sew a proper seam?" Pauline had said yes, and that had been enough. She was good at the work. She was good at the quiet and the precision of it, the way a careful hand could transform raw cloth into something beautiful and useful. She was good at the customers, too, the miners' wives who came in with money their husbands did not entirely know they were spending, the dance hall girls who came in after hours and wanted something pretty and did not care what anyone thought about it. Pauline had no judgment to spare for anyone else's choices. She was too occupied with surviving her own. By summer, she had a reputation for fairness and fine work. By fall, she had saved enough to rent a small room that was hers alone, with a window that faced east so the morning light came in first thing and touched everything gently. She had a cat named General who belonged to no one and came and went as he pleased. She had a routine and a purpose and the closest thing to peace she had felt in a very long time. And then Abraham Keating rode into Creede on a Tuesday morning in early October, on a bay horse with a white blaze down its nose, and went directly to the sheriff's office, and everything Pauline had built began to tremble at its foundations without her even knowing it. She did not meet him until the following Thursday. He came into the shop in the early afternoon, when Mrs. Buckley was at lunch and Pauline was alone behind the counter, finishing the hem on a wool skirt. He was tall, not dramatically so, but tall enough that he had to angle himself slightly when he came through the door, and she noticed that. She noticed the way he moved, too, which was careful and economical, like a man who had learned to take up exactly the space he needed and no more. He had dark hair going gray at the temples. She put him at perhaps 35, maybe a year or two either side, and brown eyes that looked at you with a directness that was not unfriendly but was absolutely not casual either. "Good afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon," she replied and did not stop sewing. "What can I help you with?" He removed his hat. That small courtesy registered with her despite herself. "I am looking for a gift," he said, "for my sister. She is getting married in the spring, and I thought I'm not sure what I thought. I'm not experienced with this sort of shop." He looked genuinely uncomfortable, and there was something so human about that discomfort, something so unperformed that Pauline had set down her work and come around the counter before she had quite decided to. "What is her coloring?" she asked. "Your sister." "Fair, brown hair, about your height. And the wedding will be held where?" "Pueblo. Her husband-to-be has a ranch outside of town." They had talked for 20 minutes. He had bought a length of ivory ribbon and a pair of white lace gloves that Pauline had recommended with quiet certainty. He had paid without haggling, which she noted, and he had thanked her with the kind of sincerity that was not practiced. When he left, the bell above the door rang twice, the second ring an echo of the first, and Pauline had stood for a moment in the resulting quiet and told herself that she had no reason whatsoever to think about him again. She thought about him again immediately. He came back 2 days later. Not for anything he had forgotten. She could tell that he had manufactured a reason, which was another piece of information she filed away carefully and tried not to examine too closely. He had questions about whether Hortense Buckley could make alterations to a jacket. He had questions that lasted 30 minutes and resulted in his returning the following Monday with the jacket, which did not in fact require very significant alteration. By the end of that second week of October, Abraham Keating had been in the shop 4 times. They had talked about the silver market and the territorial legislature, and the books she had visible on the shelf behind the counter. He had mentioned in passing that he was between permanent situations at the moment, that he did some range work and some other work, the nature of which he had been agreeably vague about. He did not volunteer a great deal about his history, but neither did he perform the kind of pointed silence that meant a man was hiding something specific. Or so she had thought. He asked her to dinner on a Friday. She said yes before she had time to talk herself out of it. The dinner was at the Exchange Hotel, which was the best establishment Creede had to offer, and was therefore still fairly rough around the edges, but had tablecloths and candles and a cook who had worked in St. Louis, before a sequence of unfortunate decisions, had deposited him in a silver canyon in the Colorado mountains. The food was excellent. The conversation was better. He told her about growing up in Missouri, near the Kansas border, the youngest of 5 children on a farm that the land itself seemed determined to swallow. He told her about coming west after the war. He had been too young for the actual fighting, but old enough to understand what it had cost, and about the years of drifting that had followed, the various occupations and geographies that had accumulated into something resembling a life if you did not examine it too closely. He told her these things without the self-pity or the bravado that men usually attach to such stories, and she found that she trusted the plainness of it. She told him, in return, less than the truth but more than she usually told anyone. She told him she was from Denver. She told him she had needed a change and had found one. She told him about the shop and about the east-facing window, and even about General the cat, who had recently brought her a dead mouse as a gift and seemed offended when she was not more enthusiastic about it. Abraham had laughed at that. Genuinely laughed, not the polite acknowledgement of humor that men performed for women they were trying to impress, but actual laughter that reached his eyes and briefly erased the careful composure that seemed to be his natural expression. She had felt that laugh in her sternum like a warm hand pressed against a cold window. Walking back through Creed's main street afterward, with the sound of the saloons and the dark mountain rising above the canyon on either side, he had asked her if he might call on her again. She had said yes again, with the same combination of clarity and chaos as the first time. On their third evening together, he told her that he had to ride out the following week to check on some cattle concerns in the high country before the snow came in seriously, and asked if she might be interested in a day ride before he left, that the aspens were at the tail end of their color, and the mountains above town were extraordinary. She had agreed, because she had already established that her better judgment did not function properly in this man's vicinity, and because she wanted to go, simply and honestly wanted it. She had not known that the cattle concern was a fiction. She had not known that the ride into the mountains was the beginning of the trap that had been laid for her 3 weeks ago, when her husband, her legal husband, the man she had fled Denver to escape, the man named Gerald Harlow Wells, who had 3 times put her in a position where she counted herself fortunate to escape with her life and her sense of self still intact, when that man had hired a private detective to find her and bring her back. She had not known any of that. She had known only that the morning of the ride was clear and cold and beautiful, and that Abraham Keating had arrived at the shop at 7 in the morning with 2 horses and a saddlebag of provisions, and a look on his face when she came out in her riding clothes that she had been carefully not thinking about ever since. They had ridden up out of the canyon and into the high country above Creed, into a landscape so extravagant in its beauty that speech seemed inadequate to it. The aspens were exactly as he had promised, the last of their gold trembling in the mountain air, and above them the peaks were dusted white with early snow that caught the morning light and threw it back in pieces. She had felt the tension she carried permanently in her shoulders begin, gradually, to release. That was when the sky changed. She had been watching it from the moment they left the valley floor, because she had lived in the mountains long enough to know how fast the weather could shift at elevation. But this had come faster than even that experience had prepared her for. By noon, the sky was the color of pewter and the wind had swung around out of the northwest, and there was a smell in it that was unmistakable to anyone who had spent time above 8,000 feet in October. Abraham had felt it too. She had seen him look up and assess, and make a calculation she could not fully read. "We should turn back," she had said. "There is a line shack another mile ahead," he had replied. "We can shelter there and wait for it to pass. It may be nothing." She had agreed because she trusted him, because she had been, for the preceding 3 weeks, in the gradual and dangerous process of learning to trust Abraham Keating. And now here is the dark irony that she would turn over and over in her mind during the long snowbound days that followed. The shack had not been a coincidence. He had known it was there. He had been planning to bring her to it, to hold her there while he sent word back to Denver that she had been located. The storm had simply arrived before his plan was ready to execute. The blizzard caught them between the ridge and the tree line. It came down from the northwest with a speed and ferocity that was biblical in its intensity, and within 30 minutes of reaching the shack, the world outside the single small window was a wall of moving white, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. They had found the shack stocked. It was a rancher's emergency shelter, kept provisioned for exactly this kind of situation, with firewood and a sack of beans and some salt pork and coffee and a tin of hardtack, enough for a week if they were careful. The horses were secured in the small lean-to attached to the back wall, where they could hear them moving occasionally, a sound that was both reassuring and entirely incidental to the central problem of the situation, which was that they were stuck here together, and Abraham Keating knew things that Pauline Wells did not, and was going to have to keep knowing them while she looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had begun, God help her, to feel things she had not let herself feel in years. The first day was almost comfortable in its false normalcy. They had made a fire and cooked beans and talked with the easy fluency that had developed between them about the storm and the shelter and the practical questions of keeping warm and keeping the fire going through the night. She had slept in the bunk and he had slept on the floor near the stove, rolled in a blanket, and in the morning there had been no diminishment in the intensity of the snow, only the adjustment to the fact of it. The second day was when things began to crack at the edges. Pauline was not a woman who could sustain comfortable pretense indefinitely, which was one of the reasons she had eventually been unable to sustain the pretense of her marriage. She noticed things. She always had, since childhood, a gift that had served her well in needlework, and rather less well in relationships, because the same eye that could identify a dropped stitch from 10 feet away could also identify the small inconsistencies in a person's presentation that most people never saw. She had been noticing things about Abraham Keating since the first day in the shop, things she had interpreted as the ordinary mysteries of a person's interior life. On the second day in the shack, she began to notice different things. He was too careful with his saddlebag. He kept it near him with a deliberateness that was disproportionate to its apparent contents. When she asked casually whether he kept any paper or a pencil she had wanted to sketch, it being one of the habits she had developed in Denver and maintained since, he had hesitated a fraction of a second before saying no. But she had seen the edge of a folded document when he had opened the bag to get his tobacco, and the shape of it had been familiar. She had seen documents like that before, legal documents, her legal name at the top of one. She had not confronted him then. She had turned back to the fire and stared into it, and done something she was very good at, which was thinking very hard while appearing to think about nothing at all. By the third evening she had constructed a complete and entirely accurate theory of what Abraham Keating actually was, how he had actually come to Creed, and what the purpose of this mountain ride had actually been. And then she had said it aloud in the dark when the lantern went out. Now they were on the fourth day. The morning of the fourth day arrived with a stillness that was almost more alarming than the noise of the storm, because it was the stillness of deep and permanent snow, a smothered world. Pauline stood at the small window and looked at the white that covered everything to the height of the windowsill and continued past it, and understood that they were not leaving this shack today, or tomorrow, or the day after that. Abraham was making coffee. She could hear the sounds of it behind her, the scrape of the pot on the stove, the specific weight of his movements. Since her revelation of the night before, something had shifted between them that was not exactly comfortable and was not exactly uncomfortable. It was the feeling of two people who have finally, terribly, arrived at the truth and are now in the exhausting and unfamiliar position of having nowhere left to hide. "The document in your bag," she said to the window. "It is a writ of return. My husband's attorney filed it in Denver." "Yes," he said. Behind her the coffee sounds continued. "And the photographs. He provided you with photographs." "Yes." How long did it take you to find me? A pause. 3 weeks from when he hired me, but I had been in Creed for 2 weeks before I approached you. That landed differently than she expected. You watched me for 2 weeks. I observed the situation, he said, and she could hear in his voice that he understood the inadequacy of the distinction. She turned from the window. He was facing her, the coffee pot in his hand, steam rising between them like a small weather system. His face in the gray morning light through the snow-filtered window was different than it had looked at the Exchange Hotel by candlelight. It was older, she thought, and more honest, and she was not sure which of those qualities she found more disquieting. Then you know, she said. You know what you observed during those 2 weeks. I know what I saw, he said carefully. Then say it. He set the coffee pot down on the stove with a deliberateness that seemed to be about buying himself a moment. I saw a woman who had built something real and good. I saw a woman who was not. I saw someone who was not what I had been told. What had you been told? That you were unstable, that you had taken property that was not yours, that you had abandoned a loving husband without cause. She heard the past tense and the particular flatness with which he delivered it. And now I have spent 3 weeks in your company, he said, and I have not seen a single piece of evidence for any of those things, and I have seen considerable evidence against them. Gerald has money, Pauline said. She said her husband's name the way you might name a weather condition, not with hatred exactly, but with the flat factual acknowledgement of something dangerous and impersonal. He has money, and he has the correct social connections, and he has the ability to present himself as a reasonable man, which is a skill he has perfected over many years and at considerable personal expense to the people around him. Tell me, Abraham said, and it was not a demand. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of invitation that has space in it for refusal, and that quality of spaciousness was the thing that made her answer. She told him. Not everything, not at once, but over the course of that fourth day, in front of the fire with the snow muffled and permanent outside, she told him the essential shape of it. She told him about Gerald Harlow Wells, who was 15 years older than she was and had courted her with the systematic thoroughness of a man who collected things. She had been 22 when they married in 1885, and she had believed herself to be making a reasonable and fortunate choice, because Gerald was wealthy and educated and charming, and everything her mother had raised her to consider a successful conclusion. She had not known, at 22, to look for the things that were absent rather than the things that were present. She had not known to notice the way Gerald was charming to everyone in public and entirely different in private, or the way his affection had a transactional quality to it, a sense of account-keeping that meant his generosity was always a debt she owed. She had not known to recognize that what she had taken for strength and certainty in a man was actually control, and that it extended to where she went and who she spoke to and what she read and how she dressed, and whether she was permitted to maintain the friendships she had before the marriage, which she was not. The first year she had adjusted. She had told herself she was learning his ways, that marriage required accommodation, that she was young and perhaps unreasonable in her expectations. The second year she had tried harder, tried to be precisely what he wanted, tried to sand down the edges of herself that he found inconvenient. The third year she had begun to understand that there was no version of herself that would ever be small enough for Gerald's comfort, because what Gerald actually wanted was not a wife but a possession, and a possession that had its own thoughts and preferences was by definition a defective possession. She did not tell Abraham about the specific incidents that had made her leave. She found that she could not, quite, speak them aloud, not yet, not to this person who was still in the process of becoming someone she trusted. But she told him enough, and she watched his face while she told him, and she saw nothing in it that looked like disbelief or performed sympathy. What she saw looked more like anger, quiet and controlled and pointed inward as much as outward, the anger of a man who was working out his own part in a story he did not like. "When did you decide not to go through with it?" she asked eventually. He looked at her directly. "I am not sure I have formally decided yet," he said. "But I have not sent any communication since we left Creed, and I have not been inclined to." "The storm decided for you," she said. "The storm helped," he agreed. "But it was already becoming difficult, before the storm." There was something in the way he said difficult that she chose not to follow immediately. She put it away for later, which was a habit of hers, to take the things that mattered and set them aside carefully to be examined when she had the resources for it. They ate salt pork and beans for dinner. She taught him a card game she had learned from a circuit judge's wife in Denver, a game that required a degree of strategic deception that she was considerably better at than he was, which she found amusing, and which he accepted with a grace that seemed genuine. He lost 4 hands in a row and won the 5th and accused her of letting him win, and she told him that was an insult to his intelligence and possibly to her own, and they were laughing, actually laughing, and then they were not laughing because something had come into the space between them that was too large and too complicated for laughter. "Pauline," he said. "Do not," she said. "Not yet." He nodded. He picked up the cards and shuffled them and dealt another hand, and they played out the evening in a silence that was charged but not hostile. And eventually she climbed into the bunk, and he arranged himself on the floor, and the fire settled, and the snow pressed its white weight against the walls. And Pauline stared at the ceiling and thought about the specific way Abraham Keating's voice had been when he said the word difficult, and understood with a clarity she found inconvenient that she was in considerable trouble. The 5th day brought a change in the light. Not a break in the storm, not yet, but a subtle shift that suggested the worst of it might be past, that the snow was delivering its last freight rather than its first. Pauline saw it in the morning and felt the complicated mixture of relief and something like loss that told her more about her internal state than she was entirely comfortable knowing. Abraham was already up when she woke, which meant he had slept badly, or had not slept, because when he slept still and quiet, and she knew now the specific sounds of his genuine rest versus the pretended rest of a man trying to give her privacy in a space where privacy was geometrically impossible. He was sitting at the single small table by the window with a mug of coffee, looking out at the white, and something about the set of his shoulders made her feel a tenderness that she immediately tried to reroute into something more appropriate. "I owe you some information," he said, without turning, as if he had heard her wake up. "You owe me considerably more than information," she said. "I know." He turned then. "But information is what I have to offer this morning." She came and sat across from him at the table and wrapped her hands around a mug and waited. He told her about himself, not the edited version she had received over dinner at the Exchange Hotel, but the real one. He had been a Pinkerton operative for 6 years before he went independent. He had left the agency after a case in Chicago that he described in terms of results. A woman had been returned to a situation that had damaged her further, despite Abraham's private certainty that the situation was wrong. And those results had been the end of his ability to operate within the machinery of an organization that did not ask him to have opinions about outcomes. He had been working independently since then, taking cases he felt comfortable with, or so he had told himself. "And then someone came to you with money," Pauline said, "and a story that I did not examine carefully enough," he said. "Because it was a large sum of money and the story was coherent, and I had been in Pueblo for 3 months and I was restless, and a restless man is not always a careful man." "What did Gerald tell you?" "Largely what I said before, that you had a mental instability that posed a danger to yourself, that you had taken a sum of cash from the household accounts, that he was concerned for your well-being." He paused. "He cried," he added, with a flatness that contained significant editorial content, "when he told me about missing you. He produced a photograph and said how worried he was. He is a skilled performer." "He is," Pauline agreed. "If I had met you before I took the case," Abraham said, "I would not have taken it. He said this not as a declaration designed to make her feel something, but as a plain statement of assessment, and that plainness was what made it land so squarely in the center of her chest. "But you did take it," she said. "I did. And you are telling me now that you will not complete it." "I am telling you now that I cannot," he said, and the distinction between will not and cannot was one she examined carefully and found significant. The word cannot implied necessity, something beyond choice, something that had already happened inside him and could not be reversed. "What does that mean for you?" she said. "Practically, Gerald will not simply accept that you failed. He will want his money back. I will return it. He may do more than want money. He is not someone who accepts failure from people he employs. I have managed difficult men before. Not like Gerald." "Tell me about Gerald," he said, leaning forward slightly, and she understood that he meant the specifics, the things she had not told him the day before. The things that would make clear the actual dimensions of what she had left and what she had risked by leaving. And on the 5th day of being snowbound in a 12-foot cabin in the Colorado Rockies, with the storm beginning its slow withdrawal and the fire between them and the cards still on the table from the night before, Pauline Wells told Abraham Keating everything. She told him about the specific incidents she had not told him the day before. She told him about the systematic nature of it, the way Gerald had worked not through obvious dramatic violence, but through something more grinding and more total, the isolation from anyone who might give her a different perspective, the financial control that was absolute and arbitrary, the manipulation that was so practiced it made her doubt her own perception of events. She told him about the night she had finally understood that she had to leave, and the manner in which she had done it. Not with his money, she told Abraham. She had taken only what was hers, what she had brought to the marriage or earned within it, and not a dollar more. She told him about the woman in Creed who had helped her, a former Denver society wife who had made the same journey 5 years earlier and had built herself a life in the mountains on her own terms, and who had helped Pauline disappear with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for the opportunity to be useful. Abraham listened to all of it without interruption. When she finished, the fire had burned down and neither of them had noticed, and the light through the window had shifted from gray morning to a brighter, whiter afternoon light that suggested the storm was indeed pulling back. "You are the bravest person I know," he said. "And I say that having known some people in circumstances that required genuine bravery." "I am not brave," she said. "I was desperate. Those are different things." "Sometimes," he said, "they are exactly the same thing." She looked at him across the table and felt the thing she had been trying not to feel for 5 days, and probably for the preceding 3 weeks if she was honest about the accounting, which she was at last prepared to be. She felt it settle over her like the snow had settled over the mountain, heavy and transforming, turning the landscape into something unfamiliar and quietly extraordinary. "Abraham," she said. "I know," he said. "We have a problem," she said. "Several," he agreed. "Gerald is not going to give me a divorce easily. He will contest it. He has lawyers and money and the willingness to be vicious." "I know some people," Abraham said carefully, "in the legal profession, not in Colorado specifically, but in circumstances like yours, the territorial courts can sometimes be, there are avenues. It will take time, but it is not impossible. And while it takes time, he will be looking for me." "Yes." "And you will no longer be the one finding me." "Correct. Which means he will hire someone else." "Yes." He met her eyes steadily. "Which is why the plan of you staying in Creed as you have been, under your own name, is no longer viable. He knows where you are now. He knows because I found you and reported your location before I came to speak to you. I sent a telegram from Creed the day before we left for the ride." He said this with the particular quietness of a man delivering a fact that he knows will hurt and has chosen not to soften. "I told him I had found you and would make contact. He will be waiting for further word. When it does not come, he will act." Pauline absorbed this. "How long before he sends someone else?" "If we are back in Creed within a week, which the weather may allow, another week after that before anyone he hires could arrive, assuming he acts immediately. 2 weeks, at the most. She stood up from the table and went to the window and looked out at the brightening world of snow and rock and blue-white sky where the clouds were finally, visibly, beginning to break. 2 weeks. The life she had built in Creed had a 2-week lifespan unless something changed, and the thing that would have to change was either the law or her geography or both. "I will not go back to Denver," she said to the window. "I will not go back to Gerald. I want that to be absolutely clear." "It is clear," Abraham said behind her. "It was clear before you said it." "Then what I need is a plan." She turned. "Do you have one, or are we going to need to build one from parts?" He almost smiled. "I have the beginning of one," he said. "It requires your trust, which I understand is asking a great deal." "Tell me the beginning," she said. He told her. It was not a complete plan, he said so honestly, but it had a workable shape to it. He had, in his years as a Pinkerton operative, accumulated a network of contacts and a knowledge of legal procedure that was broader than a layman's. He knew a lawyer in Pueblo, a man named Franklin Carter, who was principled and not easily intimidated, and who had handled cases of a similar nature. He knew that Colorado's territorial courts were not identical to the federal courts in their approach to matrimonial cases, and that in the right circumstances and with the right documentation, a legal separation that was practically difficult to reverse could be achieved. He knew that the first priority was to get Pauline to a location where Gerald's second operative could not find her quickly, while the legal process was initiated. "Where?" she asked. "There is a town called Saguache, further south and west. Smaller than Creed. I know the sheriff there. He is an honest man. If you could establish yourself there for the period required by the legal process, you would have some protection." "How long would the legal process take?" "Months," he said. 6 months at the outside, probably less if Carter is as effective as I believe him to be. Months in a strange town. Yes, she considered this. "And what do you do while I am in Saguache for months?" The question hung in the air between them with considerably more content than its surface words contained. Abraham looked at her with those brown eyes that had, over the course of 5 days, lost the last of whatever careful composure they had started with. And what was underneath was something she recognized as the same thing she was looking at in herself, the same terrifying and inconvenient truth. "I thought I might stay in Saguache," he said. "If that would be acceptable." The fire crackled. Outside, a patch of sky showed blue between the breaking clouds, the first blue she had seen in 6 days. "That would be acceptable," she said, and something that had been wound very tight in the center of her chest for a very long time began, cautiously, tentatively, to release. The 6th day was the most extraordinary of all of them. The storm had retreated fully by morning. The world outside was brilliantly, blindingly white, the sky a color of blue that only existed at altitude in October, clean and deep as fresh water. The snow was deep, perhaps 3 feet in the open places, considerably deeper where the wind had pushed it against obstacles, and they would need to wait another day for it to consolidate enough for the horses to move through it without injury. But the quality of the waiting had changed entirely. The danger was past. They were here by choice now, for one more day, and there was a lightness to that was entirely different from the previous day's wait. Abraham made breakfast with something approaching enthusiasm, producing a cornmeal mixture from the provision stores that Pauline had not identified before, which he cooked into a kind of dense and surprisingly satisfying flatbread in the cast iron skillet. She watched him work with the unguarded attention that had replaced the careful observation of the earlier days, because the careful observation had been a defense mechanism, and she had, apparently in the course of the preceding 24 hours, mostly dismantled her defense mechanisms. This was either wise or catastrophic, and she had chosen to wait before deciding which. "You cooked for yourself," she said, "living alone." "For about 10 years, yes. You learn or you suffer." He flipped the flatbread with the confident economy of someone who had performed the gesture thousands of times. "Where did you live, those years?" Kansas City for 2 of them, Denver briefly. Mostly I moved around enough that the concept of living somewhere is not quite accurate. I had a room, different rooms in different places. And now. And now I have a saddlebag and a horse and an extremely uncertain near future, he said, with the kind of wry self-awareness that she had learned was his characteristic register for things that mattered to him. Although the near future is somewhat more interesting than it was a week ago. She accepted a piece of the flatbread and ate it, and it was good, and she told him so. And he sat across from her at the small table with the blue sky window behind him, and looked at her with an expression. She had no previous experience reading on him because it was entirely unguarded, and it said with a clarity that did not require words, that Abraham Keating, who had come to Creed to trap her, had instead been caught himself, and was not sorry about it, and wanted to know if she felt the same. She felt the same. "This is a terrible idea," she said. "Most worthwhile things are," he replied. "You lied to me for 3 weeks." "I did." "I will spend considerably longer than 3 weeks accounting for that if you give me the chance. I am a woman in the middle of a legal situation of significant complexity who is essentially in hiding from her legal husband and is about to relocate to a town I have never been to under uncertain circumstances." "You are," he agreed. "This is not a sensible time to begin," she paused. "A partnership," he offered. "That is one word for it." "What word would you use?" She looked at him. The morning light was extraordinary. The way it came off the snow and filled the small window and made the inside of the shack brighter than it had any right to be. She thought about what she had been before Gerald, a younger version of herself who had moved through the world with a lightness that she had believed, for several years, was gone permanently. She had recovered pieces of it in Creed, in the east-facing window and the cat named General and the work she was good at and the mountain air. But there were pieces she had not recovered, could not recover alone, because they required another person to complete the circuit. "I would use whatever word is accurate," she said. "I have had enough inaccuracy to last me." He reached across the table and took her hand. Not the 4-second hold at the frozen creek, not accidental proximity, but the deliberate taking of her hand with the full intention of holding it, and the full understanding of what that meant between 2 people who had been honest with each other. Then, accurately, he said, "I have been trying to find a reason to stay in Creed since the first afternoon I walked into that shop. And every day I found another reason, and then I found you, and then I did a thing that I am ashamed of and that I will spend the rest of my life making right if you will allow it. And I think this might be the most important week of my life, and I think you are the most compelling person I have ever met. And I think that if this is a terrible idea, then I am prepared to be a man who makes terrible ideas work through sheer determination, because I have been doing it for 36 years and I am fairly good at it." Pauline looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned her hand in his and held it back properly with intention. "Saguach," she said. "Saguach," he agreed. "You stay in Saguach. I stay in Saguach, and you contact this lawyer Carter and begin the process immediately upon reaching Pueblo. And we take this," she looked at their joined hands and then back at him, "at a pace that is appropriate to the circumstances, which are complicated." "I am a patient man," he said. "I have not previously seen evidence of that," she said. "I have been enormously patient," he objected. "I have been sitting in a 12-foot box with you for 6 days and I have not fallen apart," she finished for him. "Something like that," he said. She laughed. She had not expected to, which made it better, and his face when she laughed was something she was going to remember for the rest of her life. That particular combination of relief and warmth and something brighter underneath. On the 7th day they dug out. It was physical work, the labor of clearing the door and then the path from the door to the linta, where the horses stood patient and warm-breathed in their accumulated hay. And then the beginning of a passage through the drifts that would need to be navigated on foot for the first quarter mile, until the ground dropped enough that the snow thinned. Abraham did the heavy work and Pauline did the steady supplementary work, and they were both thoroughly cold and somewhat covered in snow, By the time the horses were saddled, and the shack was left as they had found it, provisioned and ready for the next person who might need it. Creed was 8 miles down the mountain. They made it in 4 hours, walking portions where the snow was too deep to ride safely, Pauline leading her horse and Abraham leading his, and the conversation moving between the practical and the personal in a way that felt, increasingly, like its own kind of fluency. By the time they rode back into the canyon and down Creed's main street with the afternoon sun hitting the silver-dusted buildings and the familiar sound of the town rising around them, Pauline felt two things simultaneously: the relief of return and the already understood knowledge that the return was temporary. She went directly to the shop to let Mrs. Buckley know she was alive, which took 20 minutes and involved a good deal of exclamation from Hortense Buckley, who had thought the storm had killed them both and had apparently spent several days in a state of significant worry. Pauline reassured her with genuine affection and more partial truth than she would have preferred, and then she went to her rented room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the east-facing window and felt the weight of what was coming. The leaving of this place she had made into something, the surrendering of the particular safety of Creed for the uncertain safety of Saguache. Abraham came to the shop that evening as they had agreed, and they sat in the back room after Mrs. Buckley had left and made real plans, specific plans, with dates and routes and contingencies. He had spoken to the telegraph office already and dispatched a message to Franklin Carter in Pueblo. He had made inquiries about the road to Saguache. He had arranged for a response to Gerald's next telegram, a holding message that would buy them perhaps another 10 days before Gerald's suspicion became action. He was methodical and thorough, and she watched him work through the logistics with the concentrated energy of a man who had decided on a course and was committed to its execution, and she felt, underneath the anxiety of the situation, a steady and surprising warmth. There was something very different about having someone on your side. She had not had it in a very long time, and she had nearly forgotten what it felt like. "There is one more thing," Abraham said. "Tell me." "I sent a second message today, to Gerald. I told him that you could not be located, that you had left Creed before I could make contact, and that I had no indication of your direction." She looked at him. "You burned your bridge." "I burned several bridges," he said. "Specifically, my fee for this job, my professional reputation with anyone Gerald knows, and any possibility of explaining my way out of this if it goes wrong." "Why?" "Because those are things I can afford to lose," he said, "and keeping them would have required keeping you in danger, which is not something I am willing to do." She was quiet for a moment. "The document in your bag," she said. He opened the saddlebag and took out the folded paper, the writ of return, the legal instrument Gerald had obtained, and held it out to her. She took it. She unfolded it and read it, reading the familiar language of legal procedure and her own name in formal typeface, reading the claim of her husband over her person and circumstances as though they were matters of property law, which in the way the law was written they essentially were. Then she took it to the small stove in the back room of the millinery and opened the grate and put it in. They both watched it burn. "Thank you," she said. "It was yours to burn," he said. "It should always have been." In the weeks that followed, the plan unfolded with the particular combination of careful preparation and improvisation that is the nature of all real plans, as opposed to theoretical ones. Pauline spent 10 days in Creed wrapping up her situation there. She told Hortense Buckley the truth, or most of it, and Hortense listened with the expression of a woman who had heard similar stories before and found her response was always the same: practical help without condemnation. She helped Pauline pack her things, the needlework supplies and the books and the small personal articles of a life carefully assembled from nothing. And she pressed a sum of money into Pauline's hands that Pauline initially refused, and then accepted when Hortense told her that it was in the nature of a loan, and that Pauline could pay it back when she was settled, which she fully intended to do. General the cat observed all of this from the top of a bolt of blue wool cloth, with the philosophical equanimity of a creature who had signed no contracts with any of them. Abraham left Creed 3 days ahead of Pauline, taking the road south toward Pueblo to meet with Franklin Carter while Pauline completed her arrangements. They had agreed that traveling separately was safer and that Saguache was the meeting point. He had left her with a careful and complete set of written instructions, including alternate routes and the name and address of the sheriff in Saguache who was his contact, and he had stood in the back room of the millinery and looked at her for a moment before he left with an expression that contained the full weight of everything that had not yet been said between them, which was considerable, and that was on the understanding that there would be time for it. 10 days, he had said. 10 days, she had confirmed. He had taken her hand, both hands this time, and held them briefly and carefully, and then he had gone, and she had stood in the back room for some time afterward in the particular quality of silence that follows a person's departure when their absence is felt as a shape in the air. The road to Saguache from Creed went south, and then west through mountain country that was cold and beautiful and increasingly desolate as November settled seriously into the high elevations. Pauline had hired a seat on the mail coach as far as Del Norte, and then arranged a ride with a family of homesteaders, a husband and wife and 2 small boys, who were moving their operation to the San Luis Valley. They were good company. The wife, a woman named Maria, was funny and practical and made excellent journey biscuits, and the boys were curious about Pauline with the unfiltered directness of small children, which she found refreshing after the elaborate indirection of adult social interaction. She arrived in Saguache on a Thursday afternoon in mid-November, 11 days after leaving Creed, which was 1 day late according to the plan, but within the margin of allowance Abraham had built into it. He was at the stage stop when the wagon rolled in. He had seen her first, apparently, because by the time she climbed down he was already there, and the expression on his face when she came over the side of the wagon, relief and something more than relief, something that was very near joy, was the expression she had seen briefly in the snow shack and had been thinking about during the long, cold road south. "You are 1 day late," he said. "The Del Norte road was muddier than anticipated," she said. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "And you?" "Better," he said, "now." Saguache was a small and quiet town on the western edge of the San Luis Valley, surrounded by flat scrubland with the mountains visible in every direction, a different quality of country than Creed's canyon intimacy. It was a cattle and farming town rather than a mining town, which meant it had a different rhythm, slower, more seasonal, with the particular community coherence of people who depended on the land and on each other in long-term ways rather than the transient excitement of silver. Pauline found it initially stark but grew to appreciate its space, the way you could see the weather coming from a great distance, the way the sky was enormous and honest. The sheriff, a man named Sam Delacroix, was exactly as Abraham had described him: honest, quiet, methodical, and in possession of a comprehensive practical intelligence that masked itself as simplicity. He met with Pauline the morning after her arrival and outlined his understanding of the situation and what he could and could not do within his jurisdiction, and did so with a matter-of-factness that she found more reassuring than any amount of elaborate reassurance would have been. He understood that Gerald Wells in Denver, whatever his wealth and legal connections, did not have automatic jurisdiction in Saguache County, and that any operative arriving in his town with papers of dubious validity would find the local legal environment somewhat less accommodating than they might have hoped. Franklin Carter had already begun the legal process. Abraham reported this over dinner at the one eating establishment Saguache possessed, a plain but comfortable room attached to the general store, run by a woman named Dolores who produced simple food of excellent quality, and asked no questions about why 2 people who were clearly not husband and wife were meeting for dinner with the purposeful intensity of people solving a problem. Carter had filed preliminary documentation in the Pueblo federal court and had also, with a resourcefulness that Abraham had predicted, and that Pauline found immediately impressive, identified 2 witnesses in Denver who were known to Carter, and who had information relevant to the character of Gerald Harlow Wells that would be of value in the proceedings. "He has done this before," Abraham said of Carter. "Not identical cases, but similar ones. He knows the territory." "How long is his estimate now that he has reviewed the specifics?" 4 months, possibly 3 if Gerald's response is predictable, which Carter believes it will be. 4 months. Pauline spread some butter on a piece of bread and looked at the pale oil lamp above the table and thought about 4 months in Saguache. She thought about it practically. She would need income. She would need occupation. She would need to establish herself sufficiently in the community that Sam Delacroix's protection would be backed by the community's own inclination to accept her presence. She had skills. She had the millinery and sewing work, and she had already, on her walk from the stage stop to the boarding house that morning, observed that Saguache's provision for those services appeared limited. "There is no millinery here," she told Abraham. "I noticed," he said with the slight emphasis of someone who had been hoping she would say exactly this. "You looked. I conducted a survey of available commercial establishments," he said with complete composure, in the spirit of being useful. "The boarding house has a suitable front room," she said. "I spoke with Mrs. Vargas about it this morning. She indicated she would be open to an arrangement. You also have this well in hand," he said, sounding neither surprised nor diminished by this. Sounded something else, something she was learning to identify as the specific quality of Abraham Keating's admiration, which was not an effusive or decorative thing but was substantial and warm and felt entirely real. "I have been having to have things well in hand for some time," she said. "I have gotten accustomed to it. I am not intending to take it from you," he said. "To be clear." She looked at him across the lamp. "I know," she said. "The winter in Saguache was its own kind of education." Pauline set up her workroom in the front room of Mrs. Vargas's boarding house within 2 weeks of arriving, and within a month she had established a small but loyal clientele drawn from the ranching families and the townswomen, and even, with some initial awkwardness that resolved into genuine friendliness, the Mexican-American families who were a significant portion of the valley's population, and whose women had textile traditions and aesthetic sensibilities that Pauline found fascinating and learned from with enthusiasm. A woman named Guadalupe Medina became first a customer, and then a kind of collaborator, her embroidery work combining with Pauline's structural sewing in ways that produced pieces of real beauty, and eventually something approaching friendship that Pauline valued a great deal. Abraham had taken on work with a cattle outfit southwest of town, which was legitimate range work, and kept him occupied during the days in ways that she could see were good for him. He was a man who needed physical occupation, whose thinking was clearest when his body was tired from something honest. He came to dinner at the boarding house 3 evenings a week, an arrangement that Mrs. Vargas had organized with a cheerful and complete disregard for convention that Pauline suspected was deliberate. Sam Delacroix and his wife joined them occasionally, and sometimes Guadalupe and her husband Tomás, and the evenings had a warmth to them that was specific and irreplaceable. They were careful with each other. They had talked early on about the necessary patience, about the fact that trust was built in time, and that the specific shape of what had happened between them in Creed, the deception and the confession and the snowbound week of arriving at honesty, meant that the foundation they were building on needed to be tended with particular care. Abraham was scrupulous about this in a way that she found occasionally maddening and always reassuring. He did not press. He did not assume. He showed up consistently and completely, and let the consistency do its work. December brought the first significant news from Carter in Pueblo. Gerald had received the filing and had responded through his lawyers with a counterfiling that was aggressive but, in Carter's assessment, not particularly legally sophisticated. It had the quality of someone accustomed to using money and social pressure to get results, and not entirely sure how to proceed when those tools were not immediately effective. Carter was cautiously encouraged. He believed the Pueblo court would be receptive to the evidence regarding Gerald's conduct, particularly given two additional witnesses who had come forward, former household staff, whose testimony regarding conditions in the Wells house on Blake Street in Denver was damning and specific. Abraham read her Carter's letter by the fireplace in the boarding house sitting room, and she listened to it with her hands folded in her lap and the firelight on her face, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment. "It is real," she said. "It is actually going to work. Carter is confident." "I was not sure I believed it would actually work," she said, "even while we were planning it. I did not let myself believe it." Abraham folded the letter carefully and set it on the side table. "Believe it now," he said. She looked at him. "Abraham, yes. I would like to stop being careful," she said. "Or not stop. I will always be careful, but I would like to be careful about fewer things." He understood her precisely. "What would you like to say?" he asked. "That I love you," she said, with the plain directness that was, by now, the established register of everything important that passed between them. "I understand the timing is still complicated, and I understand that we are in the middle of a legal process and that my situation is not fully resolved, and I understand all the reasons why this declaration is premature by any conventional measure. And I love you, and I wanted you to know it, stated simply, without all the circumstantial hedging I have been doing for the past 2 months." Abraham was very still for a moment. Then he moved to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and took her hand. "I have loved you," he said, "since the 3rd afternoon I spent in that shop in Creed finding excuses to ask about jacket alterations." He paused. "I want to be honest about that. Even while I was doing a thing I should not have been doing, the feeling was real. It was what made the thing I was doing increasingly difficult. It was what made the storm, despite everything, not entirely unwelcome." She turned toward him. The firelight was warm and the room was quiet, and outside the San Luis Valley was cold and enormous under a winter sky full of stars. "Merry Christmas," she said softly, and it was mid-December and the timing was inexact but the sentiment was correct, and he laughed the real laugh that she loved. And then he kissed her, the first time, careful and certain, and it was both exactly what she had expected and entirely more than that. The winter continued its deliberate course. January brought a cold that made November seem moderate, the valley flat and frozen, and the mountains above it white to their bases. And Pauline and Abraham spent the cold evenings in the boarding house sitting room talking and reading and playing cards. She was teaching him to win more consistently, which he was approaching with characteristic methodical commitment, and occasionally dancing in the cleared space by the fireplace when Tomás Medina brought his fiddle, and the gathering extended to include the full informal community that had assembled itself around them in the months since their arrival. There was one difficult week in February when Gerald's lawyers filed a motion that Carter had not anticipated, seeking to have the case moved to the Denver federal court on jurisdictional grounds, and for about 5 days the outcome felt genuinely uncertain. Abraham had ridden to Pueblo himself to confer with Carter, leaving Saguache on a Monday and returning on a Saturday, and the 5 days of his absence had revealed to Pauline both the extent to which she had come to depend on his presence and the extent to which she was capable of functioning without it, both pieces of information being important in different ways. When he returned, Carter's countermotion had been accepted, and the jurisdictional challenge had been denied, and Abraham had come through the door of the boarding house with the news and the specific quality of relief on his face that comes from a genuine threat having been genuinely resolved. He brought her a book from Pueblo. He had seen it in the window of the general merchandise store there and thought of her, a collection of botanical illustrations by a naturalist who had traveled through the Rocky Mountain region a decade earlier. The illustrations were exquisite, detailed, and alive, and she had held it and felt the full weight of what it meant to have someone who noticed what she loved and thought of her when they were apart. March came with the beginning of warmth and the first mud of the mountain spring, and with another letter from Carter. Gerald's lawyers had significantly reduced their counterclaims, a development that Carter interpreted as a sign that Gerald himself was beginning to reassess the cost-benefit analysis of continuing to contest. The two household witnesses had given depositions in February whose content, Carter wrote with uncharacteristic emphasis, had been extremely useful. Gerald's carefully maintained reputation as a reasonable and concerned husband was considerably compromised by the testimony of a former housemaid and a former cook who had worked for the Wells family between 1886 and 1888, and whose combined accounts of conditions in that household during that period were both credible and difficult to refute. "He is going to drop it," Abraham said, reading from Carter's letter. "Do not be sure of that," Pauline said. "He does not like losing, but he likes his reputation more than he likes the fight," Abraham said. "Carter says here that preliminary inquiry suggests Mr. Wells has political aspirations that require the maintenance of his public image. A prolonged and contested divorce proceeding in which his former household staff are providing testimony about his conduct would not serve those aspirations." Pauline was quiet for a moment, processing the very particular quality of this, the way Gerald's ambition was going to be the thing that ultimately protected her. The irony was almost literary. "Then let him have his ambition," she said. "Let him have everything as long as he lets me go." "Carter believes he will," Abraham said. Within 30 days, it was 22 days. On the 22nd day of April, 1891, Franklin Carter dispatched a telegram to Saguache informing them that Gerald Harlow Wells had agreed to an uncontested dissolution of the marriage, with a settlement that included a reasonable sum for the disruption of Pauline's circumstances and no restrictions on her future whereabouts or activities. The agreement was legally binding and had been filed in the Pueblo federal court. Pauline was in her workroom when Abraham brought her the telegram. She read it twice. Then she sat down in the chair by the window with the telegram in her hands and the spring light coming through the glass, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something that was not relief exactly, because relief implies the ending of fear, and what she felt was larger than the ending of fear. It was more like the beginning of something, the first clear note of a melody she had not known she was waiting to hear. Abraham sat down on the workroom floor beside her chair, which was, she thought, entirely characteristic of him, to simply be where she was rather than requiring her to be somewhere appropriate for the occasion. "It is finished," she said. "The worst part," he agreed. "Yes, and now?" "And now," he said, "you are free, entirely and legally free, and I have a question." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the full directness that she had learned to read as his version of his whole heart being visible. "Abraham," she said. "Pauline Wells," he said. "Will you marry me?" She breathed in. The spring air through the window was sweet with the smell of the valley grass beginning to come up, the long flat valley with its enormous sky and its distant mountains. She thought about the east-facing window in Creed and the morning light. She thought about the dark shack and the lantern going out and the truth detonating between them. She thought about 7 days of snow and the specific education of being honest with someone for the first time in years, and what had been built from that honesty and what it had become. "Yes," she said, "with conditions." "Name them," he said immediately, which was also characteristic. "We stay in Saguache. This is my home now. I like the sky here." Agreed without reservation. "I keep the workroom." "I keep working. That is not negotiable. I would not dream of negotiating it." "And you tell me the truth," she said. "Always, whatever the truth is. Even if it is something you think I do not want to hear. That is not a small condition." He was quiet for a moment with the seriousness this deserved. "That," he said, "I can promise you. I have been trying to tell you the truth since the night the lantern went out in that shack, and I intend to continue for the foreseeable future, which I hope will be quite long." She stood up from the chair and held out both hands, and he stood up from the floor, and she took his face in her hands the way she had been wanting to for some time, and kissed him in the spring light with the telegram on the chair behind her, and the mountains all around them and everything, finally, beginning to be right. They were married in June, at the little church in Saguache that had been built by the combined labor of the ranching families, and was therefore owned by the community in a way that the minister seemed to understand, was his primary qualification for the role. The wedding was small in number and large in feeling. Mrs. Vargas cried from the beginning, and seemed to consider this appropriate. Sam Delacroix stood with Abraham, and his expression was that of a man who had assessed the situation and found it satisfactory. Guadalupe and Tomás sat in the second row, and Tomás had his fiddle ready for the dancing that followed, which was held in the clearing behind the boarding house with lanterns strung between the posts and the evening sky going through its full sequence of colors above the valley. Hortense Buckley had come down from Creed for the occasion, which had surprised Pauline deeply and moved her considerably. She had arrived on the Thursday mail coach with her good dress and her characteristic practical briskness, and had embraced Pauline with the thoroughness of someone who had been genuinely worried and was now genuinely relieved. She approved of Abraham, which she expressed through the medium of interrogating him about his intentions and plans with an intensity that he underwent with complete composure, and which had the quality of a test that he passed without having been told he was taking one. "He will do," Hortense told Pauline with characteristic economy. "High praise," Pauline said. "I have known you for a year and a half," Hortense said. "I know what you need. That man has the patience and the backbone for it." Those are not common in combination. They were not, Pauline agreed, common in combination. Franklin Carter sent a letter for the occasion, which Abraham read aloud at the dinner table the evening before the wedding to general appreciative laughter, as Carter was apparently also skilled at the lighter forms of correspondence when the moment required. The letter included the information that the settlement funds would be accessible through the Pueblo Bank at Pauline's convenience, an amount that represented sufficient capital to make her workroom a genuine commercial operation rather than a cottage industry, if she chose to use it that way. She chose to use it that way. By the following spring she had turned the front room of the boarding house into a proper establishment, with a sign above the door and 2 additional sewing women employed, one of them Guadalupe's younger sister, who had a gift for the work, and whom Pauline trained with the same practical thoroughness that Hortense Buckley had once applied to her. Abraham continued with the cattle work through the first winter of their marriage, and then, in the spring of 1892, Sam Delacroix offered him a position as deputy, which was both a practical arrangement Saguache was growing, and one lawman was no longer fully adequate to the requirement, and a recognition of the particular combination of skills and temperament that Abraham possessed, and that made him unusually qualified for a role that required both force and judgment. He accepted without consulting Pauline, which she informed him was technically a violation of their ongoing conversation about the terms of their partnership, and he apologized with complete sincerity and pointed out that he had been confident she would approve, which she had, which did not entirely excuse the failure of process but mitigated it considerably. They had their first child in the autumn of 1892. A boy, which neither of them had particularly expected or preferred, but both of them found thoroughly delightful. They named him James for no complicated reason, simply because it was a good plain name that suited him, and the boy came into the world with Abraham's brown eyes and Pauline's determination, a combination that promised interesting years ahead. Mrs. Vargas became, by general unspoken consensus, a grandmother of the operational variety, which is to say she was present whenever useful and supplied opinions that were either followed or declined with equal respect. The winter of 1892 was cold and long and beautiful, in the way that Saguache winters were always beautiful if you had warm shelter and good company, which they had. Pauline had expanded her workroom by then, using the building next door when it became available, and the establishment had become something genuinely significant to the valley's economy, not large but real and hers, which was all she had ever asked for it to be. Abraham came home from his shifts with the sheriff's office and cooked dinner while she finished her work for the day, and James sat in the kitchen and supervised both operations with the focused authority of an 8-month-old who considers himself responsible for proceedings. And in the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked and read, and were quiet together in the specific comfortable quiet of people who have arrived somewhere real. There was a night in late December of that year, when James was asleep in his cradle and the fire was low and the snow was falling outside. A gentle snow, nothing like the blizzard, the polite, ordinary sort of Colorado winter snow, when Abraham looked at her across the lamplight and said, without preamble, "Are you happy?" Pauline considered the question. She applied to it the same careful attention she applied to fine work, because it deserved that, because happiness as a concept was one she had learned not to accept at face value, to look at closely and make sure it was what it claimed to be. "Yes," she said, "I am. Specifically and genuinely and without reservation." "Good," he said, with that quality of quietness that she had learned was his characteristic register for the things that mattered most to him. "And you?" she asked. He looked at her with the unguarded directness that had replaced, entirely and permanently, the careful composure of the man who had come into a millinery shop in Creed and asked questions about jacket alterations. "Yes," he said, "more than I knew to want." She smiled at him. Outside, the snow fell gently on the valley, and the mountains stood patient in the dark, and the fire settled, and in his cradle James Wells Keating made the small sounds of a sleeping infant who has no knowledge of the extraordinary sequence of events that preceded his existence, and will have to be told the whole story eventually, in appropriate installments, beginning perhaps with the part about the snowstorm and the lantern going out and 2 people, finally, stopping their pretending. In the spring of 1894, they had their second child, a daughter this time, who came into the world with Pauline's coloring and, by early indication, Abraham's composure, and whom they named Clara after a gray tan of Pauline's who had been, by family report, the most sensible woman in 3 generations of her family. Clara proved immediately to have opinions, which she expressed with a vigor that suggested she had inherited Pauline's directness along with her coloring, and which her brother James observed from a position of philosophical 2-year-old detachment. The shop grew. The town grew. Sam Delacroix was elected county sheriff in the fall of 1893, and Abraham became his deputy of record, a position that suited him in the way that good work suits a person whose particular skills and values are finally finding their appropriate application. He was known throughout the valley as a man of absolute reliability and clear judgment, and the reputation was accurate, which Pauline considered the best possible kind of reputation to have. Hortense Buckley retired from the Creed Millinery in 1894, the silver having declined significantly and the town thinning out accordingly, and came to Saguache. She moved into Mrs. Vargas's boarding house and became, in short order, the most practically useful person in the valley, with opinions on everything and the experience to back most of them up. She was also, it emerged, wonderful with children, a fact that surprised no one who had seen her manage her clientele, and James and Clara regarded her with the specific reverence that small children reserve for people who are both formidable and entirely on their side. There was a letter from Denver in 1895. Not from Gerald. Gerald was married again, to a woman from a good family who had, Pauline hoped sincerely, some means of protecting herself that Pauline had not had. The letter was from one of the household witnesses who had testified in the proceedings, the former cook, a woman named Mrs. Albertine Cole, who wanted Pauline to know that she had used the modest sum she had received for her cooperation with the legal process to start a small catering business in Denver, and that it was going well, and that she had thought about Pauline often and hoped she was well. Pauline wrote back immediately and at length, and a correspondence began that continued for many years. The year 1895 also brought a notice from the Pueblo Bank that the initial settlement funds had been fully accounted for, and that a small additional sum had been identified by Carter's office as correctly belonging to Pauline under the terms of the final agreement. A modest amount, but a real one, representing some property valuation that had been miscalculated in the initial filing. Carter's letter noted that he had enjoyed working on the case and would be pleased to assist with any future legal requirements. Abraham read this out to Pauline over the breakfast table, and she had laughed at the dry precision of the legal language, and he had laughed at her laughing. And James, now 3, had laughed because they were laughing, and Clara, on the floor, had regarded them all with the composed superiority of a 1-year-old who has not yet been given a reason to find adults amusing. By the spring of 1896, the workroom had become, in fact, a proper commercial establishment that required a proper name, and after several weeks of discussion that involved opinions from every person in their circle, all offered with complete confidence, none of them entirely agreeing, Pauline settled on Wells and Keating Fine Sewing, which was both accurate and, she thought, contained a story in its conjunction. The in-between two names that had arrived at each other by a route that was neither direct nor easy, but that was, in every way that mattered, right. Abraham put the sign up on a Saturday morning in April, standing on a ladder above the door in the spring sunlight with a hammer and the careful, methodical thoroughness he brought to everything. And when he climbed down and stood beside her on the street and they looked at it together, she took his hand the way she had taken it in the snow shack that 7th morning, with intention and without hesitation. "It is a good sign," he said. "It is a very good sign," she agreed. The valley stretched away in every direction, enormous and lit with morning, and the mountains stood around it, white-tipped still in April, patient and permanent, the same mountains that had once, in a single extraordinary week of snow and truth-telling, and the particular courage of two people choosing honesty over the easier thing, done both of them the very great favor of refusing to let them leave. She had not thanked the storm for that exactly, but she had thought about it. She had thought about the specific geometry of it, the way the snow had come down at precisely the right moment to hold them in place long enough for the pretending to become unsustainable, long enough for the truth to insist on itself, long enough for what was real between them to refuse the smaller shape that circumstance had tried to give it. She thought about it the way she thought about the east-facing window, as one of the essential facts of the life she now had. The things that had been given to her, and the things she had made herself, and the things, the best things, that she and Abraham had built together from the wreckage of what had brought them to the same 12 feet of mountain shelter at the same impossible moment. James was tugging at her skirt. She looked down at her son, with his father's eyes and her stubbornness and the specific uncomplicated happiness of a 3-year-old on a sunny morning, and felt the full accumulated weight of everything that had led to this moment, all of it, the hard years and the escape, and the shop in Creed and the storm, and the 7 days and the truth and the fight and the settlement, and the ring on her finger and the sign above the door and this child, and the one inside laughing at everything from the floor, and found, as she had found before and would find again, that the weight was not heavy. It was, in fact, the most substantial thing she had ever held, which was appropriate, because it was the most real thing she had ever had. Abraham put his arm around her. She leaned into him slightly, which was a gesture she had learned she could make, and which he received without words, which was exactly right. James announced that he required breakfast with a specificity that suggested he had inherited something of his grandmother's opinions. Somewhere inside the shop Clara was probably dismantling something with her characteristic purposeful focus. The morning continued. The mountain stood. The valley held everything it was asked to hold. And Pauline Wells Keating, who had once believed that the word free was something that applied to other people's lives, stood in the spring light in front of the sign with her name on it and understood, with the quiet certainty that only comes after the hardest kind of earning, that she had been entirely right. That first morning in the east-facing room in Creed, when she had woken up and thought, "This is what freedom feels like." She had been right then, and she was more right now, because what she had found since that morning was that freedom on its own is a beginning, a necessary and hard-won beginning, but that what it grows into, when it is tended carefully and chosen over and over again by two people who have agreed to be honest with each other no matter what the storm brings, what it grows into is something richer and more permanent than freedom alone. It grows into a life. A whole, complete, luminous, entirely one's own life. And that, in the end, had been worth every single difficult mile of the way.